3 primary parts of the brain, actually 4 for this conversation. Take your thumb, put it in the middle of your brain. Who remembers what this is? The amygdala. For our purposes, we're going to broaden it a little bit. The amygdala rests in the limbic system. So this will be the limbic system that we'll be talking about today. These here is your what? Prefrontal cortex. This is the part right here. We wrap this over our limbic system. Here we have the brainstem, very close, so close that if you turn the lights down, you wouldn't get some difference. And this is responsible for regulating heart rate, regulating breathing, etc. And we also have the cerebellum, which plays a very important role in movement and becomes very important when we talk about exercise. Now, when we're doing our thinking, when we're in the law school, sitting down in front of our books and we're reading, which part is primarily going strong, do we hope? Prefrontal cortex. Then somebody sits down and says, yeah, I got an A on that, because they just found their test results. And you start to go, what do I got? What starts to happen there? The limbic system, the amygdala starts to get a little active. That's right. And then when you decide you want to get up and start running, and your heart rate sort of is able to maintain itself to some extent, what part is sort of playing a role there? The brainstem in combination with the frontal cortex, okay? Because they work together. And what's important is this. Notice how all these parts touch. Do you notice how the cortex is touching the limbic system, which is touching the brainstem? Because these neural fibers are connecting the brain, and what we'd like to have is a brain that's integrated. A brain that has these fibers connecting one part to the next. So that when we do get up to do something, when we are in class, when we are sitting down to take an exam, all of these parts of the brain, the limbic system, which has an emotional charge of interest. Do we want to be interested when we're sitting down to read a case? Being interested in that case is everything. The limbic system is very important for that. Nestled in the limbic system, however, and it's going to be the focal point of what we talk about today, is what? What is a key part of this limbic system that has to do with memory? And it's very relevant that here we are on the law school campus. That's a hint. That's correct. Good, hippocampus. We have the hippocampus. The hippocampus is very much associated and connected to the limbic system. It's part of the limbic system, right nestled next near the amygdala, because our emotions and our memory are so closely intertwined. And the limbic system and the hippocampus is the seat of memory. Bear that in mind. Okay, now, so this is our brain. How many neurons do you think make up the brain? 100 billion neurons. There's 100 billion of these little neurons in our brain. And our brain takes up about 2% of our body weight, yet 20% of the consumption of glucose, because it is always going on strong. Now, this is the structure of our brain. Now, what's happening and what's being released by our brain? Neurotransmitters. So there's glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter, and glutamate tells the neurons to do something, to act. They excite things. GABA, and if you're into yoga, we'll talk about GABA in a little bit. GABA tells it inhibits the firing of neurons. Slow things down. You don't have to fire. If your limbic system is going crazy because the professor in class is asking you a question and you're a little bit overwhelmed, you're about to take a test and there's a question you don't know, that it's like, is this, did I even take this class? What is this? And you're like, part of you is going to be saying, it's okay, you'll be fine, don't worry. That's this part here, right? Part of you saying, you are crazy, this is the worst thing in the world. GABA, if you've got some of it, comes out and says, it's okay, amygdala, it'll be okay, and tones it down, inhibits its firing. If there's not a whole lot of it, it just becomes an emotionally hijacking moment. There's also dopamine, and dopamine is important for things like attention, learning, reward system. There's serotonin, sort of the police officer of the brain, sort of everything under control, get too angry, tones it down. If, depression, anxiety, sort of keeps it in check. And then there is norepinephrine, which is very important for perception, attention, motivation. Think about how these pieces of the puzzle are very important for you actually studying, actually exercising. And these are released naturally as a part of, well, in a little bit, exercise. And when our brain is flowing smoothly with these neurotransmitters, everything is going well. And when they're not, that's when we find ourselves getting overly exacerbated and overly taken by the things that are happening. We'll see how exercise plays a role in that. We're not going to focus on those, though. They're not going to be the focus of today's conversation. But I want you to be aware that these neurotransmitters are extremely important. They mediate all the processes. And exercise is key for having the flow. Who's heard of BDNF? Brain-Derived Neurotrophic Factor. Okay. So in 1991, there were maybe 12 articles on brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Not a whole lot of stuff going on. It wasn't that interesting to people. Nothing really was making a whole lot of hoopla about it. But then people realized that brain-derived neurotrophic factor, something that's also in the brain, whereas the neurotransmitters are important for the processes of the brain, mediating attention, mediating motivation, mediating arousal, stuff like that. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor seems to be, it's called a factor, there's a variety of factors in the brain, it's a protein. It seems to be associated with the infrastructure of the brain. The infrastructure of the brain, the neurons, the connections between neurons and the synapses, making connections bind together. And they found that when brain-derived neurotrophic factor was sprinkled on some neurons in a petri dish, just sprinkled on some neurons in a petri dish, that the neuron began to sprout dendritic branches. Let's take a moment to just talk about the structure of a neuron so we know what that means. In fact, would you stand up? You can be my co-neuron. We aren't going to touch. We aren't going to touch.
Right.
Because neurons do not touch. Anybody think that when neurons wire together, they are touching?
Not anymore.
Okay, so you are an axon. Put your hand out. Stand there. Put your arm out. You're an axon. Okay. He's been excited by something. Okay? I'm going to make this up, but I have a basketball. Do you like to play basketball?
With my back, sure.
Okay. So I pass you a basketball, and you're really excited. Now this is the neurotransmitter. It might be glutamate. It might be GABA. It might be dopamine, serotonin. It might be any of a lot of different possible neurotransmitters. But it's been passed in this space, and you're excited about it, so you've picked it up. Okay. Now, if enough of this stuff comes in to him, he will get excited. But he's excited. Now put your arm out, like really like ah. Okay. And this is the electrical impulse running along the axon, and I'm here, and I'm a dendrite, and I'm looking for what then comes out of here, which is not the electrical impulse. It now turns back into a neurotransmitter. It's like a ball that you bounce. If I'm into that ball, I will grab it, and then I will repeat the process and send it along the way. If, let's say you don't like, you like ping pong?
Not really.
Okay, so I throw you a ping pong ball, and you're like, do that. Say, Okay, and that's the end of it. Nothing happens. There's no charge. There's nothing that's firing along the way. Thank you. Guess how many of me's there could be for his axon? One axon, shooting out one signal, coming out with one plop of neurotransmitter. 10,000, maybe even up to 100,000. It's like Twitter, right? You can say, today's going to be a great day because there's a football game on. And you send out to everybody who happens to be following you on Twitter. There could be 100,000, there could be 10,000, there could be 2. How many do you have? You don't have a Twitter account. Okay. And all those people might be going, oh, that's really interesting. If they're excited by it, they would be excited by it, and then they might pass on that information to someone else. So this is how the neural impulse continues along from one part in the brain to another as it moves from cortex to limbic system all over the brain to pass on these signals. Now.